Allahi wa barakatuh. Wa alaikum assalam to all the brothers and sisters that said salam. Can everyone hear me? MashaAllah. That's it. MashaAllah. إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه ثم أما بعد. So today we'll be covering the 18th juz, inshallah. This will be the final time that I'll be here, inshallah. So I suppose which is good because you guys won't have to put up with me for much longer. So going on to the 18th juz. I'm not sure why it's coming up like this, but anyway, there are 202 verses in juz 18. 118 in Surah Mu'minun. So there's 3 surahs in juz 18. So there's Surah Mu'minun, Surah Nur, and Surah Furqan. 20 verses of Surah Furqan and juz 18. The rest, the entirety of the surahs, meaning Surah Mu'minun and Surah Nur, are in juz 18. Surah Mu'minun and Surah Furqan are Makki, whereas Surah Nur is Madani. The key themes are there. They all intertwine, to be honest, especially between Surah Mu'minun and Surah Furqan, considering that they are both Makki. So there's mention of Aqidah, of Risala, of resurrection, description of the believers, testimony, especially in Surah Nur. There's certain ahkam there about the hudud as well. So these are the key themes which come up in Juz 18 specifically. But we'll be covering one verse, or a set of verses rather, from Surah Mu'minun, a set of one verse from Surah Nur, and then if we have time, inshallah, we'll go into Surah Furqan. So these are famous, the 10 ayahs which I've listed, these are the famous 10 ayahs of Surah Mu'minun. And the name of Surah Mu'minun comes from the first ayah, which is قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, that the believers have been successful. And so this is where the name of Surah Mu'minun came from. These are 10 ayahs which describe how a believer should be, as in his everyday life, how a believer should be. What are the qualifications that he needs to enter Jannah? One day the Prophet ﷺ, the revelation was coming onto him, and Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu was present there, and then the Prophet ﷺ said, أُنزِلَ عَلَيَّ عَشْرُ آيَاتٍ مَنْ أَقَامَ بِهِنَّ دَخَلَ الْجَنَّةِ. That 10 verses have been revealed to me. Whoever sticks by them, whoever upholds them, he will surely enter Jannah. So these are the 10 verses. So first, it's as if like the title comes first. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. The mu'minun have been successful. So the believers have been successful. Now, how do you become a believer? So step number 1. الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. Those who adopt humility in their prayers. Imam Ahmad Rida Khan, he actually translates this as those who cry in their prayers. Meaning the first step to become a mu'min is that he has to cry in his prayers, or she has to cry in her prayers. Step number 2, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ. Those who stay away from useless talk. So this is step number 2. Step number 3, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ. Those who pay the obligatory zakat, the tax, the charity that they need to pay at the end of the year. وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ. This is sifa number 4 now. So those who protect their private parts. إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. Except those who go towards their wives or what their right hand possesses, and there's no blame upon them. This is a oft repeated verse in the Quran sometimes. إِلَّا مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. So whatever your right hand possesses. So it's essential that we understand what this means as well. This is in reference to slaves or concubines, and sometimes it's just there lingering in the back of our heads, and we choose not to question it because we're scared we may not understand it. But the issue isn't as complicated as we may seem it is. Before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, slavery already existed, as in the Byzantine, in the Rome, even in Persia, slavery was widespread. So when the Prophet ﷺ came, it wouldn't have been pragmatic for the Prophet ﷺ to completely get rid of slavery all at once. And the way that you can understand that is if you look at interest banks today. If someone was to come today and say that we're going to abolish interest completely, the entire world will go, it would be complete havoc in the world, because most countries in the world, in fact, probably 95% of them or 97% of them, their state banks take interest loans out. In fact, every single pound which is circulating in the UK right now, every single pound which is in your pocket right now, is interest money. And so for someone to come today and then say that uh, why was interest why hasn't it been abolished yet, or why can't someone just get rid of interest? The reason is because it can't. It simply can't. It's so it's become the fabric of society. Because if you remove it, society will collapse. And similarly, slavery at that time, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was the fabric of society. To remove it, where would those women go? Where would those children go who were enslaved? So instead, what the Prophet ﷺ did initially is that, aside obviously always giving the command to free slaves, like you miss a fast, you free a slave, you've done a sin, you free a slave. So aside the ongoing inculcation to try and emancipate slaves, the Prophet ﷺ gave slaves rights. And this is another thing which I thought I'd mention, is that when we talk about slavery, when we mention the term slavery, the first connotation that comes to our mind is the slavery of the African trade slave, which happened in America. So the moment someone says slavery, we think of flogging, we think of torture, we think of rape, we think of people being oppressed, and so on and so forth, which is true. Most slaves were like that, even in pre-Islamic Arabia. But in Islamic Arabia, after the arrival of the Prophet ﷺ, he alayhi gave slaves rights, which meant that they had to be fed, they had to wear the same clothes as their master, they had a right to even free themselves. As in there's the ayah of Mukataba, where if a slave wants to be free, he would say to his owner that, look, I'm going to do X, Y, Z job for you, and after that, you need to agree that you'll free me. In fact, there's a narration where once a slave, he wrote this condition with his master. He said, look, after such and such thing, you're going to have to free me, and he refused. And the slave went to Sayyidina Umar, radiallahu anh. He said, look, this is what he's doing. And Sayyidina Umar flogged him or told him off harshly, saying that if the Quran is allowing it, فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا, that allow them to do the mukataba if you see any good in them. If the slaves are pious and they're good people, then you should allow them to be free the moment they agree to it. So Sayyidina Umar enforced this. In fact, there's Ibn al-Jawzi mentions once that Sayyidina Umar was once walking and he saw some people eating, and the slaves, they were standing up. And Sayyidina Umar asked that, why are you eating and why are you standing up? And the slaves responded that, or the people responded that, look, we're the masters, these people are slaves, why should they eat? And Sayyidina Umar told them off, and he forcefully fed the slaves. And Sayyidina Umar and Ibn Jawzi mentions that day Amir al-Mu'mineen did not eat. In fact, he made the slaves eat instead. So that's why slaves in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they could be understood as what we would say today as a butler or a maid. So they were given rights. They were permitted to lead the salah. They were teachers. Many of the slaves of the companions, Ridwanullah alayhim ajma'in, they were great ulama. So slave was just a name more than it was like it wasn't an attribute which would stick with them. They always had the choice to free themselves from that as well. So I hope that clarifies it. So illa ala azwajihim. إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم. So except from their wives, so you're permitted to go towards your wives or what your right hand possesses. And these were slaves, which obviously rape was not permitted at all. Someone's asked a question. I don't understand the second question about fueling Hugh's economy, but I once read that congregational prayer of the slaves is impermissible. Why is that so? So this is, it's not that it's impermissible. Some ulama of the opinion that, for example, the leadership of a blind man or a slave is not liked because people look down on him, but this isn't always the case. It's not that it's impermissible, it's fine. So illa ala azwajihim, except if they go towards their wives or what their right hand possesses, then there's no blame upon them. Then the فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. But whoever goes beyond these measures, so whoever goes into haram, falls into zina, then he's crossed the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set. Then the next sifa comes, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. Those who keep up their promises and their trusts and their pledges, meaning it's not from the characteristics of a mu'min, of a Muslim, to to be treacherous. If he signed a deal, he signed a deal. وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَى صَلَوَاتِهِمْ يُحَافِظُونَ. And then finally, those who look after their prayers, the people that look after their prayers. And as a result of all of these things, what will happen? أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْوَارِثُونَ. They will be the inheritors. الَّذِينَ يَرِثُونَ الْفِرْدَوْسَ وَهُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. They will be in the inheritance of paradise, the inheritors of paradise, and they will reside there forever. In the tafsir of this, there's many different narrations. One of them which comes to mind is that قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ was actually said by Jannah itself. Allah permitted Jannah to speak. After Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Jannah, Jannah said, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. The believers have been successful. Meaning one of the attributes of attaining Jannah is to be what Jannah wishes you to be, which is a believer. And how do you become a believer? By these 10 things. One of my teachers, he would say, better, these 10 verses, they come in order. He said, look, those who adopt humility in prayer, they will always be the ones who will stay away from idle talk. And those who adopt humility in prayer and stay away from idle talk, they will be the ones who give zakat. And the one who does these 3 things, they'll be the ones who will not fall into zina. And the one who does all of this, then he will not be the one that will break his pledge or promise. And then the one who does these 5 and then he looks after his salah, this is the entire package now. He'll be given Jannat al-Firdaus. He says one leads on from the other. And this is interesting when I was thinking about it, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us to this dunya to be tested. But he also gave us the answers. Now, if I was to, like I teach students sometimes, if I was to give them a test and I'd say, look, these are the answers, here's the exam paper. For them to fail would be a complete shame on them. Like what were they thinking? How could they fail when I've given them the answers? And when you look at it from that perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the answers to life, how to attain Jannat al-Firdaus. So the exam paper is here, the questions are there, the answer is there. It's just about literally writing them down, or in this situation, putting them into action. So we ask Allah for afiyah. Then I thought we'd go on to the ayat of Surah An-Nur. Are there any questions so far? Then I thought we'd go on to the ayat of Surah An-Nur. This is called Ayat An-Nur. It's in Surah An-Nur and it's called Ayat An-Nur. It's oft repeated and oft recited. Sometimes you go into like on Instagram or things like that, and you'll see it being repeated and people recite it often. But the reason I chose this verse is that sometimes we don't know what it's really talking about. And I thought I'd mention this verse specifically with but I feel like it's essential that I mention that there are multiple tafasir of this verse alone. But then Shaykh al-Akbar ibn al-Arabi has his own tafsir. Then the tafsir bil-Ma'thur is different. Then the tafsir of the Sufiya is different, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to mention one tafsir, but I thought before we do that, it would be based on, let's look at the translation first and what we understand from it, and then we'll look at one tafsir. It would be tafsir al-Muqatil, bin Sulaiman, and then we'll see how the verse interlinks with each other. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Is there a question? No? Are you good to carry on? There's plentiful ahadith regarding Surah Mu'minun. So regarding the final ayahs of Surah Mu'minun, it's famous where one day a person came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said that, Ya Rasulullah, inna li akhan, waji'an. Ya Rasulullah, I have a brother, he's not well. And the Prophet ﷺ said that, ma waj'u akhik. What's wrong with your brother? And he said, bihi lamamun, Ya Rasulullah. Ya Rasulullah, he has something wrong with his mind, meaning he's mentally not stable. It's not that he's mad or he's gone crazy, but he's just mentally is not stable. And then the Prophet ﷺ, Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla, he says that the Prophet ﷺ first عوذه بفاتحة الكتاب. The Prophet ﷺ first read Fatiha upon him, then 4 ayahs from Surah Baqarah, then the middle 2 ayahs of Surah Baqarah, which is وَإِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ, then Ayatul Kursi, then 3 ayahs from the end of Surah Al Imran, شَهِدَ اللَّهُ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ, then the ayah from Surah Araf, إِنَّ رَبَّكُمُ الَّذِي خَلَقَ, then the ayah of Surah Mu'minun, وَمَنْ يَدْعُ مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ لَا بُرْهَانَ لَهُ بِهِ. So this is the final ayah or the final ayahs of Surah Mu'minun. Then the Prophet ﷺ recited ayah from the فَتَعَالَى وَأَنَّهُ تَعَالَى جَدُّ رَبِّنَا مَا اتَّخَذَ صَاحِبَةً وَلَا وَلَدًا. So this is from Surah Jinn. Then the Prophet ﷺ recited the 10 ayahs of Surah Safat, and then the 3 ayahs from Surah Hashr, the final 3 ayahs of Surah Hashr, then Surah Ikhlas and Mu'awwazatayn. And Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla says that once the Prophet ﷺ had finished reciting this upon that person, he stood up as if nothing was wrong with him. In fact, Ibn Mas'ud, and this is in the Musnad of Ya'la, if I'm not mistaken, where Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh, a person was brought to him and he wasn't well. Again, mentally he wasn't well. And Ibn Mas'ud read the final ayahs of Surah Mu'minun. أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّمَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا. And he read these ayahs. And he was fine. And the Prophet ﷺ asked Ibn Mas'ud, what did you read upon him? And he said that I read أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّمَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا, the final ayahs of Surah Mu'minun. And the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, لو أن رجلا موقنا قرأها or قرأ بها على جبل لزال. If a person of faith was to recite these verses upon a mountain, even the mountain would move. So there's many virtues of Surah Mu'minun. Hope that helps always. Then I thought we move on to Ayat An-Nur of Surah Nur. This is an ayah which is oft repeated, and so we'll go through a translation first, what we understand from it, and then we'll go on to a tafsir of Muqatil. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. مَثَلُ نُورِهِ كَمِشْكَاةٍ فِيهَا مِصْبَاحٌ. The likeness of His light is niche-like, wherein there is a glowing lamp. الْمِصْبَاحُ فِي زُجَاجَةٍ الزُّجَاجَةُ كَأَنَّهَا كَوْكَبٌ دُرِّيٌّ. That the lamp is contained in a crystal globe, and this globe is like a glittering star. يُوقَدُ مِنْ شَجْرَةٍ مُبَارَكَةٍ زَيْتُونَةٍ. And this is lit by the sacred olive tree. لا شرقية ولا غربية. It's not eastern nor western. يكاد زيتها يضيء ولو لم تمسسه نار. Its oil is glowing even though fire hasn't touched it yet. نور على نور يهدي الله لنوره من يشاء ويضرب الله الأمثال للناس والله بكل شيء عليم. And so Allah guides to His light whoever He wishes, and He gives parables for the people. And Allah is aware of everything which happens. Now this is a translation of the ayah, and there seems to be iltifat. So this seems to be there's a principle of tafsir called iltifat, where an ayah is mentioned, or within the same ayah, an ayah is mentioned, and then the subject changes. Uh, Tasneem, how many ayahs of Surah Mu'minun? I've mentioned that in the first slide. You just go back and see it, inshallah. Now, the reason I chose to bring the tafsir of Muqatil here is that Muqatil bin Sulaiman was one of the greatest scholars of tafsir. Although he was criticized for some of his weak narrations in hadith, as a mufassir, he was pretty much agreed upon as being one of the greatest mufassir of his time. In fact, Imam Shafi would say that إذا أردت الفقه فأنت عيال على أبي حنيفة وإذا أنت أردت التفسير فأنت عيال على مقاتل. If you're looking for fiqh, then you're dependent upon Abu Hanifa. And if you're looking for tafsir, then you have to be dependent upon Muqatil. So this is, and he passed away, he was the student of Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who was the student of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh. This is how he understood the ayat of Nur. He said, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, meaning Allah is the guide for the heavens and the earth. There's many other tafasir. So some will say, Allahu munawwiru samawati wal ard. Allah is the one who enlightens the heavens and the earth. But we're sticking with the tafsir of Muqatil, and then you'll understand how it all makes sense and how he understood it. And he's from the Salaf. He's from the first three generations of the Muslims after Hijrah. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth, meaning He is the guider. He's the one who guides the heavens and the earth and everything which is between them. Then he says in his tafsir, he says, ثم انقطع الكلام. Then the speech stops. Now there's a new part of the verse which is starting. مثل نوره, meaning the method of the nur of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions that Allah is the light of the heavens of the earth. But now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving a parable of the light of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح. The likeness of the light of the Prophet ﷺ, whilst he was still in the loins of Sayyidina Abdullah, is niche-like, where there is a lamp. So he says the mishkat here, the mishkat refers to the loins of Sayyidina Abdullah, and misbah refers to faith, which is iman. Then he says al-misbahu fi zujaja. So that what we spoke about, that misbah, which is faith, is in a crystal globe, a zujaja. But that crystal globe is in fact the body of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, jasadu Muhammadin sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So faith, al-misbah fi zujaja, faith is all in its entirety, it resides in the body of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Az-zujajatu ka'annaha kawkabun durri, which is like the planet Venus amongst other stars. And this is literally what he says in his tafsir. He says that the kawkabun durri refers to the Prophet ﷺ and refers to the planet Venus. And you'll know after the sun and the moon, those of you that have studied even a teensy bit of astronomy like yours truly will know that even after the sun and the moon, Venus is the lightest, is the most brightest star in the sky, and it can't be missed on a clear sky. If you move away from the polluted areas of the city, you'll be able to see it. So they say that this refers to the Prophet ﷺ. Some of the Qurra, they would say Kawkabun Dirri, meaning the Prophet ﷺ is like a pearl. And according to Tafsir al-Muqatil, this Kawkabun Dirri, he is like the brightest star in the sky, alayhi salawatullah. Now this brightest star, it was yuqadu min shajaratin mubarakatin zaytuna. This was lit, and this enlightenment process, or this brightening of the star, began with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Because he sallallahu alaihi wasallam is from the descendants of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. So Shajratul Mubarakah refers to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. La sharqiyatan wa la gharbiyah. Now this is the na'at of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. La sharqiyatan wa la gharbiyah. He did not pray towards the east, nor was he western, meaning nor did he pray towards the west. Meaning he didn't pray towards the east like the Christians, and he didn't pray towards the west like the Jews. Rather, he prayed facing the Qibla. Now, this next bit is very interesting. يَكَادُ زَيْتُهَا يُضِيءُ وَلَوْ لَمْ تَمْسَسْهُ نَارٌ. It's oil, meaning this oil, Zayt refers to the prophethood now, Nabuwa. In Takadu Nabuwa. يَكَادُ زَيْتُهَا يُضِيءُ, that the Prophet ﷺ was glowing even though revelation hadn't come to him ﷺ. So even before the Prophet ﷺ, even before the light of prophethood had been, he had announced it, the light of prophethood was still showing in his actions. As in, people would even know that he was a prophet even before he had claimed it. And this doesn't just refer to the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, even before him. Like there's numerous examples from the ancestors of the Prophet ﷺ, all talking about the Prophet ﷺ. These are things which are in the books of Siyar, like for example, Ka'b bin Lu'ay is from the grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ. You should know that before the time of Islam, the day of Jum'ah was called Yawm al-Aruba. So the day of Jum'ah wasn't called Jum'ah, it was called Yawm al-Aruba. It was only when Ka'b bin Lu'ay would start to gather people in his house, they called it Yawm al-Jum'ah, because everyone would gather, the day of gathering. And so everyone would gather in the day in the house of Ka'b bin Lu'ay, and what he would talk about would be nothing else aside the fact that from my descendants there'll be a prophet. He'll be like this, he'll be like this, and he'll go to the Quraysh, and this is what will happen. And he would narrate stories of the Prophet ﷺ even before they had actually happened, because he had read them in the books like Torah and the Injil. And he would congratulate people that from his tribe or from his descendants there will be a prophet. In fact, there's even poetry related from Sayyidina Ka'b bin Lu'ay, where he would say, Ya laytani shahidan najwa da'watihi idha al-Quraysh tabaq al-haqqa khizlana. Oh, how I wish I could see the intimate conversations of the Prophet ﷺ with his Sahaba. إِذَا الْقُرَيْشُ تُبَغِّ الْحَقَّ خِذْلَانًا, when the Quraysh will be rejecting him and taking him out of Mecca. Oh, I wish I was there to see him. Alayhi salawatullah. And this even refers to, like for example, even before the Prophet ﷺ had announced prophethood, like when Sayyidah Amina, salamullah alayha, the mother of the Prophet ﷺ, I mean, the incidents are famous about when the Prophet ﷺ was born, the light was spread across the house, and in fact, the palaces of Syria could be seen, and so on and so forth. These are famous incidents. Sayyidah Amina, even there's other incidents as well, like as Suyuti mentioned in Hawi, that before Sayyidah Amina, salamullah alayha, before she passed away, she looked at the Prophet ﷺ and she said, Barakallahu fika ya min ghulami, ya ibn al-lazi fi hawmat al-himami, naja bi'aun al-malik al-allami. That, oh, may Allah bless you, you beautiful child. Sayyidah Amina talking to the Prophet ﷺ, may Allah bless you, oh beautiful child, you're the one who was saved by the Almighty Lord, بِمِئَةٍ بِإِبْلِ السِّهَامِ, that you were saved by 100 camels. And this is the famous story of Sayyidina Abdullah and how he was saved. And you can read into this in the books of Seerah. And again, this is one of the signs of Nabuwa. يَكَادُ زَيْتُهَا يُضِيءُ وَلَوْ لَمْ تَمْسَسْهُ نَارٌ, like وَلَوْ لَمْ تَمْسَسْهُ نَارٌ, that this is the light of prophethood showing even in the life of Sayyidina Abdullah, where he's saved with 100 camels, even though it was decided that he will be put to death. And these are famous stories. And even then, Sayyidina Amna, she carries on, it's a long poem, and she said, إن صح ما أبصرت في المنام فأنت مبعوث إلى الأنام تبعث بالحل وبالحرام تبعث بالتوحيد والإسلام فالله نهاك عن الأصنام ألا تواليها مع الأقوام. Sayyidina Amna says that if it is true what I have seen in my dream, and it is true what I have seen in my dream, then you will be sent for the entire world. You'll be sent for the entire universe. You'll be sent with Tawheed and Islam. You'll be sent with halal and haram. And Allah will prevent you from bowing toward these idols. And Allah will prevent you from going with them, being with such a nation that will bow towards idols. So these were the miracles, these were the lights. يَكَادُ زَيْتُهَا يُضِيءُ, as if the light was already glowing even before he announced prophethood, alayhi salawatullah. Or like, for example, the incident of in the time of Sayyidina Abu Talib, when the Prophet ﷺ was a young boy. The people of Mecca, there was a drought in Mecca, and they were going to the Kaaba and they were asking the idols for rain. And someone said that, why don't you go to the family of Prophet Ismail, alayhi salam? And Ibn Asakir and others mentioned this in their books of history as well. Can you repeat the name of the Prophet's ancestor? You mentioned Ka'b bin Lu'ay, radiallahu anhu. And when so there was a drought in Mecca, and people said that why don't you go to the family of Sayyidina Ismail, because they had asked the idols and no rain had been given. So they went to the door of Abu Talib, and they said, they knocked on the door, and Abu Talib radiallahu anh, he came out, and they said to him, Ya Abu Talib, أقحت الوادي وأجدب العيال فاستسقي لنا يا أبا طالب. Said, oh Abu Talib, Mecca has become dry, and the families are becoming, they're becoming annoyed by it. They don't know what to do. So ask Allah for rain for us. For our sake, please ask Allah for rain. And Sayyidina Abu Talib doesn't ask Allah for rain straight away. He goes back inside and he brings out this young, beautiful boy, alayhi salawatullah, and he takes him towards the Kaaba. And in one narration, he lifts him up towards the sky. In one narration, I think he puts him towards the star of the Kaaba. And Sayyidina Abu Talib, then he raises him towards the sky and it begins to rain. In fact, the narration mentions that فَأَقْبَلَ السَّحَابُ مِنْ هَا هُنَا وَهَا هُنَا وَغْدَقَ وَغْدَوْدَقَ, that clouds began to run in. They they just formed out of nowhere, and it began to rain. And then Sayyidina Abu Talib, he looks towards the face of the Prophet ﷺ, and he recites the famous poetry that all of you will probably know. وَأَبْيَضُ يُسْتَسْقَى الْغَمَامُ بِوَجْهِهِ ثِمَالُ الْيَتَامَى عِصْمَةٌ لِلْأَرَامِلِ يَلُوذُ بِهِ الْهَلَاكُ مِنْ آلِ هَاشِمِ فَهُمْ عِنْدَهُ فِي نِعْمَةٍ وَفَوَاضِلَ. Abu Talib radiallahu anh, he looks towards the face of the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, this beautiful, young, enlightened face, this young boy because of whom rain is given to us, he will grow up to be someone that will look after the widows and the orphans. And because of him, the Quraysh are in safety. And because of him, they take safety in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. يَلُوذُ بِهِ الْهَلَاكُ مِنْ آلِ هَاشِمِ فَهُمْ عِنْدَهُ فِي نِعْمَةٍ وَفَوَاضِلَ. They find safety in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is what one tafsir refers to, that يَكَادُ زَيْتُهَا يُضِيءُ, that the nubuwwah of the Prophet ﷺ, the light of the Prophet ﷺ was showing even before Prophet Jibreel had come to him with the nubuwwah. Then Nurun ala Nur, that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ he's light upon light, meaning Prophet Ibrahim to Prophet. So Prophet Ibrahim alayhi was a great prophet, but then Nurun ala Nur, Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ was even greater than Prophet Ibrahim alayhi. Then Yahdillahu li nurihi man yasha, Allah guides to his light, meaning Islam, to whom he wills, and Allah gives وَيَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْأَمْثَالِ, and Allah gives these parables of who? Of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sayyidina Rasulullah, Sayyidina Ibrahim, and even Sayyidina Abdullah radiallahu anhu. And this is actually one of the ayahs which many of the Ahl Sunnah cite to prove that the fathers and the ancestors of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam were all Muslim. Allah bi kulli shay'in alim, and Allah is well aware of all things. So this is where we'll stop, inshallah. But I thought we'd mention two ayahs about one from Surah Nur and one from Surah Mu'minun, with hope that inshallah hopefully, I'm sure that you've already read this juz today, but inshallah whenever you repeat this juz, hopefully when you recite these verses, this tafasir will come to mind, and it will only increase your love for the Quran, inshallah. Are there any final questions?